This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. We talk a lot about 2020 Deshaun Watson form, but what we have not spent a lot of time talking about is that 2020 season, because this 2020 season wasn't a season that was void of opinion or controversy as far as how people looked at those numbers. There were people when that season happened who thought that that season was unequivocal proof that Deshaun Watson was a top 5 quarterback. There were some people who looked at that season and said, hey, 4 wins. How are you a top 5 quarterback with 4 wins? To be fair, I was one of those people who felt that way about Deshaun Watson in 2020. Because yes, to me, if you put up incredible numbers and win 4 games, it doesn't mean that that season is fraudulent, but it does mean there are a lot of red flags that go off in my head. We've talked about 2020 form so much without discussing what 2020 actually is or was for Deshaun Watson that I'm afraid that the term 2020 Deshaun Watson doesn't really mean anything anymore, right? Like, he could put up the same numbers he did in 2020, and I feel like there would still be a good group of people that would argue he hasn't returned to 2020 form for whatever reason, because I don't think 2020 form has met the 2020 season for Deshaun Watson in like a couple of years. So what I wanted to do over these next 2 videos, and it's going to be a video that drops, this one you're seeing right now, and a video that drops in the morning. What I want to do is, one, evaluate what that 2020 season actually was. Was it actually impressive? Was it overrated? Was it underrated? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it inflated by certain circumstances? Or was it not? Right? Really evaluate what 2020 is, because you need to evaluate that season to really understand what the actual ceiling for Deshaun Watson is. Because if his best season in his career was a season where you can look at it with a close lens and start to break it down where it wasn't that good, then that starts to make you question what the ceiling is on Deshaun Watson. And vice versa. If you look at this season and it holds up like diamond, then that makes you understand what the potential is, so we can have a better grasp on what 2020 Deshaun Watson means, what returning to form actually means, because I feel like everybody has a different idea of what 2020 Deshaun Watson was. In the video that I'm going to drop tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about where would 2020 Deshaun Watson rank in a 2024 landscape, because the quarterbacks that were on top in 2020 ain't the same ones for the most part that are on top in that top 10 conversation in 2024. Things have changed. But let's get into this 2020 season. Was this season overrated? There's a lot of questions you can ask to say that this season is overrated. There's a lot of things that I just basically assume when I see a quarterback put up great numbers, but they only win 4 games. And I think there's a lot of things that a lot of us assume when we see a quarterback do something like that, right? We usually assume that they somehow benefited from having a bad defense because it put them on the field more. We usually assume that they were a part of the problem while either being inefficient or turning the ball over more often than people recognize. We assume that they somehow were contributors to their own failures, despite having good statistical numbers, right? Russell Wilson is a good example of this, right? Russ had good numbers last year, but not somebody you felt like contributed to winning for the Denver Broncos, so much so that the Denver Broncos decided to spend $80 million just to get rid of him. There are also examples of quarterbacks who play well. There are also examples of quarterbacks who win without playing well. Hell, even a team like the Cleveland Browns last year, who went through 5 different quarterbacks, had 24 touchdowns, 23 interceptions, still found a way to win 11 games, right? So there are some rare cases where a quarterback's stats and their win-loss record really got nothing to do with each other, right? There are some rare times where that does happen. For most cases, the win-loss record and how well a quarterback plays usually has some level of relation. Now, where that sits is on a spectrum, right? Some players, some teams are only good because they have a great quarterback. Some teams are great and they have a great quarterback, right? Like, there is a spectrum with this. I don't want to act like it's a binary where it's like, oh, either you have a quarterback and you're good and you're not. I talked about this before. A lot of us want to make sports talk a multiple choice thing, right? Where there's like one right answer and 4 options. But in reality, talking about sports, having opinions about sports, having opinions about most things, they're long form answers. You got to write it out. You got to explain why you feel it. You got to justify how you feel that way and justify why you're justifying it and really break it down in order to really say anything that's truly valid. You can't just pick A, B, C, or D and have the work lifted off of you. But that's a whole nother rant for a whole nother day. So when I look through this 2020 season for Deshaun Watson, and I really try to like zoom in and look at it, the season that holds up really well for Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson was incredible in that 2020 season. I don't think it's overrated. I don't think it's underrated. I think it's properly rated. It was a top 5 season. And here's my hot take of the video. I think Deshaun Watson took a team that should have been winless to 4 wins. And I don't know if how much better that makes it sound, but I can make a very good argument that if you pluck Deshaun Watson off this team, this Texans team wins nothing. Like, he was the only good thing about this team for the most part. Why is it that I say that? One, and I don't mean this lightly, I don't say this as somebody who has not watched a ton of bad teams, who does not know what a bad team looks like. I watched 0-16 and 1-15 in my lifetime. Deshaun Watson's supporting cast in 2020 might have been the worst supporting cast I've seen around a good quarterback in 10 years. When we talk about supporting cast, defense is a huge part of it. How good is your defense? That matters. The Houston Texans defense was awful. I'll get into that. I'll explain how awful they were in just a minute. But just know, long story short, the Houston Texans defense, awful, trash, certified garbage. Wide receivers and tight ends, garbage. Outside of Brandon Cooks, garbage. He had a decent offensive line. I think people underrate how good that was a solid enough offensive line that they had. And they performed well enough. The offensive line wasn't the 2020 Texans issue. So offensive line, fine. That running game, trash, garbage, dookie, bad. So you don't have a defense, you don't have receivers, and you don't have a run game. Now, if you don't believe me, if you don't think that the receivers were bad, if you don't think that the supporting cast was bad, if you don't think the run game was bad, you think I'm over-exaggerating, I have some numbers to show you or to tell you that will probably convince you otherwise. The run game outside of Deshaun Watson in the 2020 season for the Texans totaled a whopping 1,022 yards. 1,022 yards. Deshaun Watson was responsible for a third of the run game production. He was also second in rushing first downs. He was number 2 with 31. Without Deshaun Watson's numbers, they averaged about 4 yards a carry. They were a bottom 5 team when it comes to rushing yards per game and rushing touchdowns per game. The Texans, for the whole year, offense, passing, and rushing, had 326 first downs. Remember that number, 326 first downs. Not a bad number. Deshaun Watson was responsible for 252 of the 326 first downs. 252 of the 326 first downs were by the hand of Deshaun Watson, either throwing or running the ball. That is 77% of the team's first downs were at the hands of Deshaun Watson. Now, you might say to yourself, Quincy, well, how do we know that's really an impressive number? We don't talk about what the third down percentage of any player is. Okay, I'll bring you two examples, two favorable examples. Patrick Mahomes in 2023, where we all saw that he did not have a lot of help offensively. Like, we could all agree. Pat Mahomes did not have a ton of help offensively. You would expect Pat Mahomes to have a pretty exaggerated third down percentage number, and he's Pat Mahomes, literally the best quarterback I've seen. So he should have a crazy number here, right? And the Browns quarterbacks in 2023, because as up and down as the passing production was all season, the run game production wasn't consistent either, especially after Nick Chubb went out 5 quarters into the season. So if there are two teams that should be close to that, if this is a normal stat, it's those two teams. Well, Pat Mahomes in 2023 was responsible for 66% of the Chiefs' first downs. A huge number, a big number, not 77%. The Cleveland Browns quarterbacks, all 5 of them, rushing and passing, were only responsible for 60% of the Browns' first downs in 2023. In 2020, Deshaun Watson was responsible for 77% of those first downs. I'm not lying when I tell you this. This team would have been winless if they did not have Deshaun Watson. I'm not, and that's not even hyperbole. Like, this is just legitimately what I believe at this point after looking at it. Here's another reason why I believe this. Look at the support. Brandon Cooks is the one sought after player on that offensive roster. Everybody else that Deshaun Watson threw the ball to, let me tell you how their careers are going. Will Fuller was his number 2 option, right? Will Fuller has gotten 26 receiving yards since 2020. Don't think he was that good. Randall Cobb, who's like definitively at a down point in his career, is really only in the league because of his friendship with Aaron Rodgers. He hasn't been very productive outside of his years with Aaron Rodgers in like the 2010s. So Randall Cobb, not great. Jordan Atkins has had moments after that year, to be fair, but he's far from proving anything. I mean, we're not even convinced in Cleveland he should be the number 2 tight end. We all wanted the Browns to draft somebody to probably take a spot. So, like, how good was he? David Johnson was on that team in 2020 for the Texans. And David Johnson's career had peaked 4 years before 2020. It didn't get any better after that, by the way. I think he was out the league by 2021, retired by 2022, is what it is. Duke Johnson, one of their better players on that team, he was out the league a year after this 2020 season. Darren Fells would be out the league by the end of the next year. You got guys like Kiki Cutie, who were a part of this offense, who were like significant parts of this offense. Kiki Cutie has just recently resurfaced in the UFL, the Spring Football League. He's recently resurfaced. And I believe he's either the number 2 or number 3 receiver for the DC Defenders. And if you have not been keeping up with the UFL, all you need to know in context of this video is the DC Defenders might have the worst receiving core in all of the UFL. And he's a number 2 or 3 receiver for that team. Not good. Not good at all. That's just not good. Chad Hansen, I mean, he never played in the league again after this season, and he just got cut from the XFL last year. That's the supporting cast. That is, and then you chuck this up on top of a bad defense. The Texas defense was almost as bad versus opposing quarterbacks that year, statistically, as Deshaun Watson was good against opposing defenses that year. Watson had 4,538 yards passing, 333 touchdowns passing, and 7 interceptions with 22 passing first downs Here's what the Houston Texans secondary gave up in 2020. 4,104 passing yards. Wow. 30 touchdowns, and they got 3 interceptions. This is not hyperbole when I say this. This is exactly what is true. If you played the 2020 Texans defense 16 to 17 games, however many you want to throw in there, you would probably be the owner of one of the best passing seasons in NFL history. 30 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 4,000 passing yards. That would be an MVP. You could win the MVP if you just played the 2020 Texans all 17 games. You could just win it. You can win it. You could take a week off and you would still win it. These numbers are only based off of 16 games. That's incredible how bad they were as a secondary. I ain't even get to the run defense numbers. To Deshaun Watson's credit, like he was at least keeping them above water or at water with his passing production. So like, yeah, the defense couldn't cover worth a lick, but as long as they were able to stop the run, they would have still been a playoff team. But here's what happened with the Texans and run defense. First of all, again, I mentioned the Texans were not a good rushing team, right? They have 1,466 yards total rushing. 466 of those are Deshaun Watson. So they just weren't a good run team. They were a bad run team. We've established that. You want to know how bad of a run defense they were? If you were a running back and you played against the Houston Texans for 16 games, you would have gotten to the Hall of Fame off the back of this one season alone. You would have had 5.2 yards per carry. You would have had 2,564 yards. You would have had 24 touchdowns. And you would have gotten 145 first downs on 493 attempts. Like, here's how ridiculously bad the Texans defense was in 2020. And again, this is not hyperbole. This is literal, just facts. If you had a team that just played against the 2020 Texans every week for 17 games, you would have a team that would very likely have a MVP candidate at quarterback, an MVP candidate at wide receiver, and an MVP candidate at running back. All 3 positions. They were trash. This defense was trash that year. Just awful. Could not stop anything. Could not stop a soul. That 2020 Texans team had no business winning 4 games. They just didn't. They were that bad of a team. When I initially thought about it, just in 2020 while it was happening, a quarterback being in the MVP conversation when you have 4 wins is insane. And it will never happen because it's just inherently an insane thing to have happen. But I think Deshaun Watson might have been playing on one of the worst football teams in NFL history. Like, that is a bad team, man. That team is pathetic. And the only thing that was exceptional that year was Deshaun Watson. And that alone was good enough for 4 wins for a team that really had no business winning one. And again, I want to go back to those red flags that it raises, because when you see a guy play on that bad of a team, have that bad of a record, but have these good numbers, it raises some real questions, right? Some of the questions I had was, hey, well, maybe he was just playing against bad defenses and his numbers are inflated by just playing bad secondaries, right? And that's why he was able to put up the numbers that he did. But that's not true. If you sort it by PFF grade, PFF coverage grade, he went against, on average, the 7th ranked coverage defense in the NFL. If you want to do it with traditional metrics, he went against the 14th on average, the teams he played. So if you take all the teams he played, take all the yards they gave up, divide that by 32, on average, he played against the 14th ranked passing yards allowed and touchdowns allowed defense. He played against the 14th ranked team in interceptions on average. He played, like, the defenses he played, all evidence tells me that the schedule that he had as far as the defensive coverages that he played was average, was bone stock average. The strength of schedule isn't anything extraordinary. I don't think this happened because he played a bad schedule. There's no evidence to say that he had a easy ride against bad defenses in 2020. Well, then maybe he benefited passing wise. His numbers got inflated because his defense was bad. This is something that I thought would be true, right? His defense stinks, which means they're giving up touchdowns, which means he has to score more often, and he's going to have the ball more often because the defense isn't holding teams on the field. But that's not the kind of stinky that the Houston Texans defense was. They were the kind of stinky where they would give up a touchdown, but like consistently on like 8-9 play drives, which meant that the Houston Texans offense was bone dead last in plays. So the offense had the least plays snapped from scrimmage in all of the NFL, which means not only did Deshaun Watson not benefit from having a bad defense by getting more passing attempts, by getting more chances to score, he was actually negatively affected by the fact that the defense could not stop anything because they were just consistently on the field far too long. And when you look at Deshaun Watson's numbers, it reflects that. His offensive rating, his expected points against average are all very, very impressive for that year. His red zone scoring production, very impressive for that year. He was 70% passing while also having the highest yards per attempt that season. All very impressive stuff. Tells me he was actually just really efficient in 2020. And the final thing that pops in my head is like what could devalue this season for him is, well, maybe all of this production happened in garbage time. Nope. They had a point differential of -5. And I just told you how bad this team is. -5 ain't that bad of a point differential for a team that stinks this badly. And it's not a point differential that would suggest that they were consistently getting blown out. So if they weren't playing in a ton of blowouts, which they weren't, it's kind of silly to assume that the bulk of that production happened because of blowouts when they weren't in blowouts. Because I came into this thinking, hey, the circumstances that he was in had to have had a factor in a positive way to the production that he had in 2020, because that's the assumption that I was working off of. But everywhere I looked to prove that assumption true, I was met with evidence that that assumption was not true. That passing season that Deshaun Watson is as good as everybody says it was. It's as impressive as everybody says it was. If you understand that, you will also understand why the Browns traded so much and signed him to such a big deal, because those numbers, when you dig into them, when you look at them with a close microscope, it's even more impressive what he was able to do. How do you almost have 5,000 passing yards and you had the least offensive snaps in all the NFL? It's hard. Like, what? That doesn't even make sense. So yes, outside of the win-loss record, and there's even an argument to make that getting 4 wins out of a team that bad is kind of impressive, but nobody's going to laud you for a 4-12 season. So that's never going to happen. And there is an argument there. That season was very impressive. I walked into this video wanting to know how high the bar should be for Deshaun Watson based on that 2020 season. And I walk away thinking the bar should be very, very high for Deshaun Watson. If we're talking about him returning to 2020 form, that is one of the better quarterback seasons you'll ever see. It's a shame because he didn't win very many games and everything else that happened with Deshaun Watson's name after that, that season's going to get buried. But if he had that season on a slightly better team, he would have won 12, 13 games. They would have been a 1 seed. And he probably would have won MVP. That's my thoughts on that 2020 season. I reevaluated it. I looked at it. I challenged my own personal preconceptions coming into the year, coming into the video about coming into the process of making that video about that season, and that's what I came up with. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.